And you want to say hello?
Good evening. Yes. Glad to join you.
Nice to have you here tonight.
Interesting report.
And Frank Stringy.
Hi, everybody. Frank Stringy.
City planner.
City planner. I worked with Bob Hunt on the floodgate and Point of Pines Beach flood protection plan years ago.
Many years ago.
Yeah.
And we also have John Pocari. Like, introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm on the board of the Beach Association. I'm the designated resiliency person, and I'm about to send out a link to the survey photos. We hired a drone and did some pretty cool aerial photographs of the entire beach.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks for the photos. Councilor Powers. Councilor Powers, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
No, I'm unmuted. I'm here alive.
You are.
Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you for being here tonight. Gregory Robbins from DCR. And you're muted.
Oh, sorry.
There
I
you
didn't click
go.
hard. I didn't click hard enough. Greg Robbins, Director of Waterways for the Department of Conservation and Recreation.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Carolyn Mecklenburg.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Mecklenburg. I work for the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs at the state, and I help support the MVP program, which funded this project. So happy to see the concluding meeting tonight.
Great. Thank you for being here tonight.
Absolutely.
And Paul Argenzio.
Good evening, everyone. Paul Argenzio, Superintendent of Public Works. Glad to be here this evening.
Thanks for joining us. All right, and with that, I would like to turn it over to our presenters this evening, AECOM. Thank you for being here. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the raised hand function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. It's a little hand, looks like this. If you just click on that, at the first opportunity for a break, we will stop and take your question. If you do have any comments or questions at any time, feel free to use that function. And also, I'm just going to ask everyone to remain muted, just so we can avoid any background noise. And then I will just call upon you when you use the raise hand function. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen to get us started.
I am actually going to ask Aaron. I think Aaron is going to get us started, and then I'll in after him. So go ahead, Aaron.
Yep, we'll fire things up. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'll just pause on this screen here. I won't go through and introduce each member of our team right now, but there are several staff that have supported this great study from AECOM present today. You'll be hearing from a few of them during the presentation, and then we also have staff on hand for questions and answers. We're looking forward to a really good discussion with you all here this evening. This slide is just showing you what we hope to accomplish tonight. The introductions that we just wrapped up. We'll be moving into a review of future conditions, going through a coastal resilience toolkit, which we shared. If you participated in an earlier workshop, we talked a little bit about how we were developing that. So we'll show you the results of what came together and how that was applied to the feasibility review of the options for the Point of Pines and Riverside area. And then that'll continue into the results of how those were screened, the options that seem to kind of rise up to the top for future consideration. And then we really want to reserve a nice portion of this evening for questions and discussions. And before I hand things off to my colleague, Jennifer Doyle-Breen, I just wanted to Again, thank Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, represented by Carolyn tonight, that funded through their Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant Program. The city received an action grant which funded this study. So great thanks to the Commonwealth for such a wonderful program and for allowing this work to be done. It's utmost importance to the city of Riviera, and we think this is helping move the needle forward to future endeavors and efforts, and this has been a great experience. One other thing to note before I turn things over, you'll see a lot of numbers presented, different projections, sea level rise. I just wanted to make it clear that these are projections. This is for planning purposes. We are not designing anything at this stage. We're using the best available data that's available through the Commonwealth, and we've worked with that to the best of our abilities. And so we'll be sharing with you some conceptual preliminary planning level results with you, but please don't get stuck too much on the numbers that you see, but they are going to be used to guide future efforts, and were very important for us to help move forward with this initial feasibility assessment. So with that, I will turn things over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Yep. Hello, everyone. So we wanted to start off tonight just by reorienting everybody as to the study area conditions and what is predicted to occur in the area going forward. So I know we've gone over this in workshop 2, but just to sort of set the stage and the framework for what we're going to be talking about later tonight. This slide shows the current sea level, and this is based on NOAA data. And then the next slide shows what the study area may look like with 1 foot of sea level rise. So this 1 foot of sea level rise data, again, is from NOAA. Based on the MCFRM Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model that has been done for the state, which we're gonna, we heard about in workshop 2, and we're gonna see some results of that a little bit later on when Kira Murphy goes through some of the tool applications. But based on that model, this is approximately this level of sea level rise may be occurring in about 10 years, around 2030. So you can see it's not too different from now, although the area down to the southwest, it is more under what, sort of down near the little peninsula. Sorry, I should have primed Aaron more with the cursor. Yeah, right in there. That area is more underwater than it was in the previous slide. And then the next slide will show what 2 feet of sea level rise looks like based on NOAA. And again, the state coastal flood model estimates that this situation of 2 feet of sea level rise may occur in around 2050. So in about 30 years. Again, it doesn't look too much different from the first 2 slides we saw, but you'll notice that in the area right there, if you just saw where Aaron flicked it, in the area of the Boatworks property, actually, there's a little bit of flooding. That is, yes, that is exactly. That's encroaching now. And then the next slide shows what 4 feet of sea level rise looks like, again, based on NOAA data. So when you look at this slide compared to the last few we looked at, you can see that there seems to be a tipping point somewhere. So and the state coastal flood risk model estimates that this for around 4 feet, maybe a little bit more, 4 feet than 4 feet of sea level rise may be predicted to occur somewhere in the 2070 timeframe. So looking at these slides just gives us an idea that perhaps somewhere in the next 30 to 50 years, there may be a tipping point coming where on a daily basis. So this, again, this slide shows basically the high tide on an average day. So this is without any storms. This is just on a daily basis that a large portion of the study area would be inundated daily. So this just highlights both the need to consider some options for what could be done to protect some of these areas, and also just sets the stage for what 2070 may be like, even with some of the, if you were to implement some of the tools we're going to talk about as the presentation goes on. There's just going to be more water closer in everywhere, less beach, that's what is predicted to happen in the future. So next slide, Erin. Yep. Okay. So as Erin mentioned in the last stakeholder workshop, we went over presenting some of the tools that we were planning on evaluating for application in the study area. So we're not going to spend too much time on them as part of the presentation, but we can certainly answer questions on them if needed. But these on this slide show some of the flood reduction measures that we looked at: flood walls, deployables, elevating roadways and buildings, and flood proofing or potentially relocating buildings. Next slide, Erin. The other set of tools, the second set of tools that we looked at fall into a category that we identified as stormwater management type of tools. So these type of tools would be less effective at holding back high floodwater levels in the future, but they have a lot of benefits for helping to treat rainwater, increase precipitation, improving water quality, and also improving habitat quality for some of the applications of these. Next slide, Erin. And then the last two categories of tools that we looked at were nature-based. So the top picture just shows an example of a living shoreline. And then also non-structural tools that are at the city's disposal to help manage the future conditions in the study area. So some of the things listed here that could be considered: land acquisition, increasing public education, maybe early warning systems for flooding, improvements perhaps to evacuation procedures or amendments to those, and just reviewing the local building and zoning codes to make sure that they're being enforced and are strong enough to protect future construction. Next slide, Erin. So since the last stakeholder meeting, this is one of the things we put together. This is a one-page flyer that summarizes all of those tools that I just mentioned. This was something that we identified in the grant, as something that would be a product of the study that could be shared with other communities too, just again as a quick one-page flyer that could be available to help people just give a quick snapshot to people, to other municipalities about tools that are out there, things they might want to consider if they're looking at the resiliency measures to protect their communities. Next slide, Erin. So we looked at all those tools I just went through, and we compared them to some screening criteria that are listed here. So we introduced these in the last stakeholder meeting. And so since then, we've applied them to the tools by evaluating each tool and how it compares to the criteria listed here. So control of future predicted floodwaters was an important one. Funding opportunities, ownership, community acceptance, whether there might be conservation restriction requirements required for implementation of some of these tools in certain settings, how complex the permitting would be to implement some of these tools, and then finally, the relative cost. And again, just to emphasize, as Erin opened up with, we're going to see some cost numbers in a little bit, and we looked at, again, the relative cost, but they're very much planning level at this point. But as Erin said, we wanted to have this as a factor, so we did some initial planning level evaluations of cost to help guide the analysis of the tools. So this is a top level summary of what our findings were. And again, I think Elle made available some of the memoranda that we've developed so far. So I don't know if people have had time to read through them. There's a lot of information in there, and obviously we have a limited amount of time tonight. So this is very much a top level summary. But what we found is that the different tool, you can go, we're not, yeah, that's good, Erin. Different tools have different applicability in different portions of the study area. They have different pros and cons. The top one there, flood barriers and deployables. These tools are things that we felt were most appropriate and applicable where they could protect relatively expansive areas. So really looking at the community residential areas, which there are basically 3 in the study area. There's the Point of Pines area, there's the Riverside residential area over by Mills Ave, and then there are residences along Route 1A on the southwest side. Floodproofing and relocation of buildings. This tool was something that was identified to be feasible and very applicable for individual critical community buildings, of which there are 4 in the study area that we identified. There's, and Kira will go into this in more detail in a minute, but there's the fire station, the wastewater pump station, the stormwater pump station, and the adult daycare center. So floodproofing or potentially relocating some of those structures might be feasible for those individual buildings, but floodproofing entire neighborhoods of homes is probably not very feasible. So that's why the flood barriers were identified as more applicable tools for those settings. Backflow prevention, there are a number of outfalls, which I'm sure many of you know who are on our meeting tonight, that discharge stormwater, and at high tides, tide water can back up into them. So, it's very important that they all be evaluated and backflow prevention be put on those where it doesn't exist. Also, as I'm sure many of you in our meeting tonight know, there was a Riverside master plan being done by others at the sort of in parallel with the study that we were doing. That study identified the potential for flood storage and a pump station in the Riverside area, and that does seem like the most applicable location if these were to be feasible. There's probably a little bit more analysis that needs to be done of hydrology and hydraulics just to confirm that how those would be applied in the setting in the Riverside master area, the Riverside district.
Jen, if I could just jump in there just for 1 second. So we did
Sure.
submit an application to further that information and the details on that for an MVP action grant for the next round.
Okay, and then there were,
Thanks.
sorry, Elle, did I cut you off? Did you want?
No, that's okay. Thanks. I just wanted
Okay.
to mention that while you're on topic. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And then some of the other stormwater type of tools, again, seem most applicable in the riverfront district. It's being redeveloped, or it's under consideration. Portions of it are under consideration right now. So there are a lot of tools that could potentially be implemented there, such as the impervious cover reduction, the living shorelines, salt marsh restoration or creation. For dune protection, we did look at dune protection and restoration for the Point of Pines beach for the dunes there. And as I'm sure those of you who were on the call for the second stakeholder meeting may remember that we went through the details of the beach management plan at that call. In terms of protection, there's certainly some simple things I think that could be done, which we outlined in the plan for protecting what's there. Some of the challenges of implementing dune restoration are permitting. It's very complex permitting wise, and also funding. With the dunes being privately owned, there may be some challenges there to find funding grant sources to fund that. And then finally, the emergency response was another tool that we felt was very important to highlight, and that there are some updates that should be looked at for that in terms of evacuation routes and early warning types of analysis. So next slide, Erin. So this, what we're going to do now, I'm going to turn it over to Kira. Kira Murphy, one of our structural engineers at AECOM, is now going to talk about these first 2 that are highlighted here in some more detail in terms of how flood barriers and flood proofing could be implemented in the study area. So Kira, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Jen. So before I walk through how and where these different deployables or flood barriers can be implemented, I'm going to walk through quickly what we're protecting against as far as storms. So on the screen right now, you can see the inundation depth for the 2030 1% storm. And a 1% storm has 1% chance of occurring each year. And this is also commonly known as the 100-year storm. So as you can see, based on the colors on the screen, there are different levels of flooding predicted for the northern end of the peninsula. The lighter colors of the yellows and the reds, those are the shallower depths. so ranging between 0 to 2 feet in the green. And then the darker depths, the blues and the purples, those are the deeper areas of flooding, ranging 4 and 5 feet. And then if you go to the next slide. Now this is in 2070, again, the 1% storm, and you can see the drastic color difference as most of the peninsula is inundated with this dark blue color, which is up to 10 feet of flood inundation. Another thing I want to point out on this slide is by Route 1A, you can see a little bit of gray area. This is the high ground where there is no flooding. You can see there's only a small patch right where Erin is pointing the cursor. And if we look at the next slide, we have the same comparison now for the southern end of the project. So this is for the 2030 1% storm. You can see some of those lighter yellows and reds, 0 to 2, 3 feet of flooding, and then that darker purple as 4 feet of flooding. And then moving to 2070, once again, we're looking at mostly a dark blue screen now with 10, if not greater than 10 feet of flooding inundation and no high ground pictured in this area of the study area. So when we look at these different storms, we look at the number, the design flood elevation, or we call that DFE, of what elevation we would have to achieve in order to protect against the storms. So for today's storm, the FEMA 2020 100-year storm, we would need, depending on the location and the flood design class, say 11 to 13 feet. And then if we jump all the way to the 2070, you can see now those numbers range between 15 and 19 feet. So there's a significant jump as we get to further and further into the future. And the difference between flood design class 2 and flood design class 3 is that the class 2 are focused on protecting large residential areas, and class 3 are focused on critical infrastructure buildings that we'll get into later in the presentation. Then the next question is, how do we protect against these storms now that we've identified what they are and what elevations we would need? And so in order to do that, we have identified 3 alignments that you can see on the screen: alignment A, B, and C. So alignment A has been designed to help protect the Mills Ave area and Riverside community of the peninsula. Alignment B on the eastern side has been designed to help protect the Point of Pines community. And then alignment C, in the southern area, has been designed to help protect the residences along Route A. And as you can see, there are 2 images of these alignments. On the left, we have the alignments required to protect against today's 100-year storm. And then on the right, we have what alignments would need to protect against the 2030 or 2070. And the difference you can see most drastically with alignment B, shown in blue, is that they will need to be lengthened to reach that small area of high ground that we saw in those inundation flood maps. So that gray area right along Route 1A, they all have to tie into that high ground to keep the residences dry. And as we look into the future, that high ground becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So the alignments have to increase in length and also have to become more robust to meet the higher design flood elevations that we just looked at. So now we're going to look at each one of these alignments in greater detail, starting with alignment A. So for alignment A, you can see at the graph on the left shows the height of intervention of the wall, or HOI, as you'll see it abbreviated. And the HOI is the distance between the existing ground elevation shown in that blue color and the design flood elevation for various storms shown in the colored lines. So for example, for alignment A, today's 100-year storm is shown by that red line. So you can see the height of interventions between the grade and that red line are much smaller than the height of interventions between the grade and the 2070 100-year storm is shown in the pale orange line. And on the right, you can see with that person's about 5'10" for scale, that the height of intervention in relation to the person is quite significant in 2070 compared to either 2020 or 2030, ranging from almost 5 to almost 9 feet in height. And then when we look at implementing specific tools that we developed in the toolkit and earlier on in this study and how they would be implemented into this alignment, we came up with this layout. So this is a combination of flood walls and deployables. So we have starting at station 0 with the pink, a flood wall, starting out the alignment that wraps around Mills Ave. And that we were looking at both a fixed flood wall option or potentially a glass topped flood wall option along that avenue. And then as we rounded towards Route 1A, we're proposing flip up gates across the road. Those are deployable structures to maintain the opening and the current egress in the roadway there. And then along Route A, we propose switching out the median that already exists between the lanes in the middle of the highway with a flood wall median. And that would extend up to high ground. And now we have the same alignment for 2070. So for this alignment, you might not see a huge difference because high ground here conveniently is located at the start and the end. So the flood wall median may have to be lengthened slightly for the 2070 storm. But in terms of overall layout of the alignment, that is all that would have to change. However, the height of intervention, like we saw before, would have to increase significantly. Now we're going to look at alignment B, and alignment B protects the eastern side of the peninsula in the Point of Pines community. And unlike alignment A, there's going to be a large increase in length for the 2030 or 2070 100-year storm. Okay, so because the grade or ground elevation of alignment B varies significantly, we've broken it up into 3 segments. So looking at the profile at the first segment, same thing, the ground elevation is shown in blue, and then the different DFEs for the storms are shown in the red, green, and orange. We're looking at between a 4 and almost 10-foot difference in height of interventions shown by the person and the bar graph. And now we have the second section. So this is as we're wrapping around by the coast, and this is the highest point of existing grade in the alignment. And so you would need a height of intervention of only between almost 3 and 8 feet here. And in the final section, this is the low point of alignment B. So this would have the highest height of intervention. Now we're looking at between 6 and almost 12 feet for 2070. And as you can see, that that would be a very, very tall wall next to that person. So we're looking at in plan what kind of measures we propose for the 2030 storm. We're looking at starting with flip-up gates at the southern tie-in, and then along Rice Avenue, implementing a fixed flood wall. And then at egresses and openings, we would have deployables such as the flip-up gate or the aqua fence. And then we would easily be able to tie into high ground here. And then any homes that would be outside of the alignment, but within the floodplain, we would recommend raising to protect them from the flood.
Kira, could you talk a little bit about the functionality of the flip-up gates and the aquafence, just briefly?
Sure.
Thank you.
So flip-up gates are both are deployables. Flip-up gates typically sit flush with the road, and so you do not see them on a day-to-day measure. And they sit in a bed, and then at the time of rising floodwaters, actually flip up, if you can imagine a book like this, flipping up. And they can be powered through a variety of ways. There are self-rising ones that actually rise through buoyancy on their own during floodwaters. They can be powered using hydraulic power units. They can be powered also by manually with different equipment. And they've been implemented throughout the US on highways, driveways, main roads, a variety of different areas. And they're really great when you have a roadway and you don't have a lot of space because they are stored under the ground. Aquafence work in a similar way, except they are stored off-site and they have to be brought to site and deployed with pre-installed anchors on the road.
Thank you, Kara.
And then if we could move into the next slide, great. So this is also alignment B, but now we're looking at the 2070 100-year storm. And in order to tie into high ground for these elevations, we have to extend the alignment on both the northern and southern areas. So in the southern area, we have to extend south towards Cary Circle and then across the roadway here through property to get to Route 1A. And then we would continue with that median fixed flood wall. And then on the north side, we would again have to cross Route 1A and then add on some of this median flood wall in order to reach that high ground. Okay, and then the last is alignment C, which protects the residential areas near the southern section of Route 1A. And for this, it would be a combination again of that median flood wall in the highway with flip-up gates at any egrasses and a flood wall at the southern end. Looking at the graph again for alignment C, we're looking at max height of interventions ranging between 4 and 9 feet. And then for the southern tie-in of alignment C, this would fall outside of the project area. Shown on the right for the 2030, we'd be looking to meet a DFE of 11.6, and in 2070, we'd be looking to meet a DFE of 15.2. And those high ground points only really occur in private residences in this area, which would be quite a challenge. In addition, there is a railroad crossing that is shown parallel to where that green line is drawn. There are higher elevations on the other side of that railroad crossing, but it would be a big challenge to get over there. So that's why we are restrained by that crossing. And then looking at the critical infrastructure, there are 4 buildings that we were looking at in this category, and they are the wastewater station, the stormwater pump station, the adult daycare center, and the fire station. And we were looking into a variety of different flood protection measures for these buildings that include flood proofing the buildings, or also looking at potential evacuation before a storm techniques. And the fire station is actually right now in the process of being rebuilt. And then we looked at a planning estimate for the different alignments that we looked at, as well as the critical infrastructure buildings, and compared the 2020 100-year storm alignments versus the 2070 100-year storm alignments. And as you can see, obviously a planning level estimate that the 2070 alignments are almost double in cost what the 2020 alignments are. And this is because of the need to lengthen some of the alignments as we looked at, specifically alignment B, and also increasing the robust nature and the height of all of the alignments. And now I'm going to hand it back off to Erin.
Thank you, Kira.
Yes, thanks, Karen. Thanks, Jen, for presenting all that material. I know it's a lot to digest. If you haven't had a chance to review materials, or if this is the first workshop that you've had the opportunity to sit in on, you're getting a lot in one dose. So we'll be happy to field questions. I just have a couple more slides to get through. So here are just some takeaways from what we shared with you. Again, we were looking at kind of a menu or a toolkit of options that the city can consider as it looks to increase its resilience toward climate change and primarily coastal flooding and storm surge. There's really no one solution. There's very many differences between the study area for the Point of Pines, Riverside area, and down along Route 1. So, you know, point one, there's different options that need to be considered and are applicable. We are considering that protecting primarily the residential areas is considered feasible for looking at more of the nearer term storm events. But we didn't talk too much about the 10-year storm events. We've been focused on the mapping for the 1% or the 100-year storms. But we were also looking at other frequency events, looking at what could be achieved relatively manageable, considering the costs and other considerations that were being looked at. Going beyond that, the challenges increase. Based on some of those maps that Kira is showing, in the future, if those projections hold true, there's going to be very limited areas of high ground that you can kind of tie in any of those flood protection measures to. Also, the costs really start to grow dramatically when you look to protect against those higher elevations. And then also you have to consider quality of life. Do you want to have a very tall wall next to your household or to your beach area? And also considering kind of the issues that you have to deal with for those flood protection measures nearby. We are continuing to evaluate floodproofing measures for some of those critical facilities. We initially looked at barriers around them, but I guess there's an opportunity here where the city is currently looking to rebuild the fire station. There's improvements going on to the wastewater pump station, also looking at improvements to the stormwater pump station. So looking at integrating some of those design considerations now into what's being planned to help improve those investments. Also looking at deciding for early evacuation of the adult daycare center rather than trying to protect it and dealing with evacuation concerns for those types of populations. That seemed to be the best recommendation. And then I think the big item to kind of think on is, Revere in and of itself can do what it can, but it comes at some trade-offs. You may not be able to achieve the level of protection that I think perhaps some people are wanting to reach. And so that may kind of pull in this regional lens and consideration, which on the next slide, I'll note is being actively looked at. And there may be some discussion during the Q&A about those efforts, but trying to look at the trade-offs of what, doing it alone, it's hard for one community to take on the significance of climate change, especially in this setting that Revere is in, and looking at what the neighboring communities can do to achieve greater benefits that can benefit more of a population and critical resources. So with that said, in the next slide that I have, as I mentioned, this project is funded by an MVP action grant. The deadline for wrapping up all materials is around the corner, a couple of weeks. So we're looking to finalize our products and get our final report submitted back to the Commonwealth by the end of this month in review and coordination with the city. That ongoing regional study that I mentioned, the city's actively engaged with Saugus, Lynn, Everett, Malden, the neighboring communities to really take another look at consensus building around a regional solution, looking at this in a broader lens and more of a regional footprint. As I mentioned, this is something that is very important to look at, to consider the benefits and costs and trade-offs from communities doing it on their own versus looking to embrace more of a regional approach. And with that, that closes our formal presentation. I'll just allow Elle an opportunity to have any closing remarks before we move over to the Q&A and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, and all the members of AECOM. Thank you for an excellent and thorough presentation. We've all been working together for over a year now, and to all of the members that are here as participants and have been partners in this project. It's been a long road with a lot of very interesting and eye-opening information and details about what the future has in store for us with sea level rise and climate change for these local neighborhoods. So thank you for all the details that you have provided. I just want to mention on your last note there about ongoing regional study. So the city of Revere has taken the lead as a lead community for a regional working group, which will be comprised of members from the municipalities of Saugus, Lynn, Everett, and Malden. We will be inviting also state agencies and federal agencies to attend. And our goal is that we can expand upon the work that we've done here in Revere and expand upon the work that has been completed in other MVP analysis for the 5 communities and join together. This was really inspired by a project that was spearheaded a few decades ago. Some people on the call might chime in and tell me some information about that as well. But we really want to just come together as a region and evaluate these potential solutions that may work well with other solutions for other communities also. So really just thank you to everyone, our internal staff, DPW, police and fire department, the Office of Planning and Development. So many people here have supported this project as well. And especially thank you to Mayor Rigo, to Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Carolyn Mecklenburg is on with us tonight for funding this study. And also to our Revere City Council. We have Councilor Zambuto is on the line tonight, Council President Zambuto, and Ward 5 Councilor John Powers, who has always been in support of these projects to increase our resiliency. So without further ado, I'd like to open it up to the floor. If anybody has any questions, please use the raise hand function if you have questions or comments, and I'll go ahead and call on you. Just I don't have access to unmute you, so you will have to unmute yourself. I'm going to call in Councilor Powers first. Thank you.
Thank you all. My question is, what can be done in the immediate future to abate the overtopping on Mills Avenue, in certain areas of Mills Avenue? I mean, long-range plans are fine, and I'm sure will be very valuable to the city. But I think right now, people experience anytime there's a high tide or accompanied by a full moon, the water just flows right over Mills Avenue. And the people down there have no real protection. And I'm wondering what the city can do. We've just received $32 million from the Commonwealth, from the feds, and the Commonwealth has received, I guess, $1 billion. And there are people suffering every time we have a storm. And that's something that, like I said, the long-range plans are great, but I think I would like to see some recommendations and some action in the immediate future to protect those residents. That's my question.
Do you want me to take that, Al?
Oh, I can start. John, that's a very good comment and question. And we did have an earlier deliverable and focus to look at more of those short-term measures that the city could look at to address those more immediate concerns that would have lower cost, lower permitting considerations that could help out some of the problems that the city and residents are experiencing today. So that was not the focus of the presentation for tonight. We were looking more focused on the long-term, longer range scenarios. But there are materials available through this study. This study was comprised of many tasks. In the final report, we'll be covering and touching on all of the elements, one of those being more of those short-term measures that could be assessed and evaluated. So be definite to make sure that you're connected with those materials and have an opportunity to review them. But Elle or Frank, do you have anything else to add to that?
I do. So in workshop number 2, which was our last workshop, we covered a number of a variety of different options that could be used if we are aware of a storm coming, that we can do as a short-term deployable until we're able to implement and fund these longer-term measures. So I'm happy to share those details with you as well. Some of those include sort of temporary walls, temporary barriers, and they do, as Aaron mentioned, require less permitting. So they could be done at a quicker pace on a temporary basis while we are seeking the longer term mitigation measures. I don't know if Aaron or Jen or Kira, if you happen to have any of those handy. I think there was one sheet that may have shown some of those. If while we're talking, you're able to pull one of those up, that might be helpful to provide a visual.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have that readily available, but I'll
Okay.
One comment I was going to make, and I don't know if Kira may be able to pull that up or not while we're talking. But the other thing I was just going to point out is that something that we, I know Elle and Frank are aware of, that we have discussed briefly in some of our previous internal meetings with a smaller group, is that something that could be considered too is thinking about a flood barrier along Mills Ave in more of an incremental fashion. So sometimes these flood walls can be built starting at a lower height, and you can increase them over time. So, and that is another thing to consider for implementation, is building some protection there in a phased manner.
Yes, that's true. We did discuss that. Frank, did you want to comment as well?
I was just going to comment on the city's internal efforts to undertake stormwater improvements along Mills Avenue. We know those outfalls are all clogged, and we get frequent flooding almost every high tide or a normal high tide in that area. So our engineering department, in coordination with DPW, is looking at a redesign of the interior drainage system there with a pump station. Obviously, that would have to go hand in hand with some sort of flood wall protection to prevent coastal flooding from the back shore of the river. What they're designing now is basically something to handle stormwater protection, and that is in its preliminary stages, but that's something I see that can be done within the next couple of years, and it's a necessary component of what this overall plan is trying to design to do. So that, along with the other recommendations that you made regarding the management plan for the dune area, would provide temporary flood protection for more frequent storms as well. So, I mean, there are varying degrees of tools that we can use here, and incrementally they can serve to solve a lot of the annoying nuisance floods that we get on a more annual basis. So there are efforts being undertaken by the city internally to try to take care of those problems. And Elle is working on other funding mechanisms to help deal with the longer term efforts. So I think the direction we're heading is very proactive, and I just haven't seen this type of excitement and interest in this flood protection of this area in a long time since the Army Corps of Engineers effort. And this is very gratifying to see this being undertaken, just get the ball rolling on some of these smaller and larger projects.
I do have, Elle, our task 3 memo, which I could try to share my screen and just show a couple of photographs if you want
Sure,
me to do that.
I think that would be helpful for council.
Oh, it looks like Aaron's already beat me to it.
Okay.
He started screen sharing.
Yeah,
Great.
I don't, there may be a better depiction of this. This is what I had readily at hand. These are some slides that were presented at the last workshop, stakeholder workshop number 2 earlier this year, where the focus was on these short-term resilience measures. Again, there is a more detailed memo, but these were the slides that were presented. So this is looking at some of the deployable measures that were referenced, things that can be stored offsite, brought out and erected when needed. Others can be left out on site in more of a permanent fashion, but here are some options that were identified and discussed. I'll scroll down here. Again, here are some other on-site measures. Like I said, for these, there would not be any deployment needed, but you would see them day to day. So there's that aesthetic or visual impact, but removes that risk of getting them deployed in time to hold back those waters. Then I think, as Frank mentioned, that gets more on the Mills Ave Riverside section, looking at what could be done there. On the beach management side, or Point of Pine side, we looked more closely at what could be done with improving the resource that is there now to make it more resilient, looking at potential additional plantings, looking at some changes to the existing pathways connecting the beach to the residents. We came up with a suite of recommendations ranging from, establishing the record keeping. There's been an interest also of tracking changing shoreline with aerial photography. One of the participants noted they recently got the services of a drone pilot to take some aerial photographs of the area, doing some of that documentation and monitoring. And then also potential sand augmentation, the planting, as I mentioned, public outreach, things of those nature. So this is all summarized in more of a memo format, but just a snapshot of some of that content from earlier.
Thank you, Aaron, for bringing that up. And thank you to Jen for touching on some more details about the deployables. We did have, just an update, we did have a Point of Pines Beach Association meeting, and Jack, you can feel free to chime in here as well. It was very well received that we would begin the record keeping as a role, that somebody on the board would assume that role of record keeping going forward. And also just a thank you to Jack Bakari for going ahead and seeking those services for the drone to document all the current sand fencing and the current conditions of the beach. So thank you, Jack.
No problem. I sent out the, I just sent everybody a link to the photographs. So you all can have a look. There's a little bit of paragraph of explanation how it was done and what we have there. We hope to, I'd like to create a 3D map. That technology is a little beyond us in terms of a cost at this time. But at least we have the data. The data is saved. So.
Thank you.
I also want to say that, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I also want to say that, my focus is really on the vegetation, the dunes, and I've seen, there's nothing I can do about, the 100-year storm, but we talk about the 2017, 2018 storm, and the tidal title photograph sort of says it all, with the water coming over the seawall. Well, it only came at what the water was sufficiently slowed by the dunes. Dunes are everything to us at this point, and the vegetation, has is expanding. It doesn't take much money just to put up some of the zigzag fences to give it a little bit more encouragement. Thank you for showing me the aerial photographs. I'm not going to speak to the whole plan. It's pretty complicated. But one more thing, I'd like to get a copy of the PowerPoint from the second and third meeting, second meeting and this meeting, to show the board. I don't know about them sitting through this whole presentation. I mean, that would be good too, but if this
Great.
meeting is being recorded, a link to that as well.
We
Yes,
can send those links out to the board, not a problem.
great, thank you.
Thanks, Jack. At this time, I'd like to invite anybody else that has any comments or questions, and also to remind everyone that you do have until this Friday if you want to send in written comments. If you're not comfortable or prepared to send anything in just now, that can be sent to myself at ebaker@revere.org, and we will review any comments that you have and consider them for addition.
Okay, Al, this is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
How are you? I just have some questions as to the process from this point on. This is an excellent presentation, an excellent report. Now, are we looking to look into this report and kind of prioritize certain elements of it? Or are we just presenting this package as a whole?
Yeah, so that's a very good point, Paul. So our internal team will review the comments that we've had and the recommendations and prioritize according to funding strategies and what we can achieve next for the short term and the long term, which is one of the reasons why we asked that when we embarked on this project that we looked at some short-term solutions as well as long-term solutions under sort of full understanding that the long-term solutions are going to be a lot more expensive and require a lot more funding in order to implement. So we would consider some of the short-term measures as an immediate relief while we plan for the long-term.
To me, it seems as though Councilor Powers kind of hit the nail on the head. It seems as though the Riverside side of the Pines is the most compromised right now.
That's true.
I don't know who made this suggestion. I apologize, but the idea of a wall that can be later built upon over the years to make it higher as necessary sounded like, an excellent idea.
Absolutely, and I think that everyone would agree that that's really the most vulnerable point of the study at this time, and there are the most people that are at risk as well.
Right, and the dune restoration or continuing to build on the dunes that exist on the other side seems like a very feasible and it's worked very well over the last few years. I mean, I can remember years ago going down there when the dunes weren't there and responding to some storms over the years. That seems to have helped immensely. And if you could continue that on down the other end of the Pines and make it a little bit more consistent, that seems like a relatively, not inexpensive, everything's expensive, but something that is doable fairly quickly.
That's true. And also some of the other recommendations, which could be done incrementally if adopted by the Beach Association, were recommendations to have raised walkways. So that would allow the dunes to spread underneath the walkways, as opposed to having the walkways be pathways for the water to reach the neighborhood.
Okay, and maybe you can enlighten me as to this public-private partnership between the city, the state, and the Point of Pines Beach Association. Who has final say as to what happens down there? Who can it be stopped? Is it something that the association is on board with? I know there's private landowners there. If 2 or 3 landowners of the association agree, and then there's one holdout or 2 holdouts that say, no, you're not coming on my property, how does this impact this whole project?
It's a very interesting point you make, Paul. And I think what really has to happen is we have to take the information and the data that we have. And at that time, you know, now that we're prepared with all this information, we can have a sit down and we can discuss what our potential options are. And hopefully we'll be able to come to a consensus and be able to move on from there so that we're able to protect the entire neighborhood without having any gaps.
Okay.
But it's absolutely, it's a necessary conversation that we need to have. And it's an excellent point you raised, because there are parcels that are privately owned. And in order for this project to be successful for everyone involved, meaning the 450 residents that live in the Point of Pines, we can't have any sort of small parcels or gaps in order for the project overall to be successful.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Mhm.
Anyone else at this time?
Elle, can you hear me?
Yes. Bob Hunt.
Just a few comments on each of the areas. On Riverside, I certainly agree with the folks when they say design the wall so that the foundation is strong enough to withstand another 1 or 2 feet raising as sea level rises. Riverside certainly can be protected to a higher elevation. And that should probably be commented to in the report, even though you don't need to do a detail on it. As far as alignment C, as many of you know, I spent about 10 years and $2.5 million looking at the same problems. And so I do have that advantage. But on alignment C, you not only have to put a wall along North Shore Road, you have to raise some improvements along Revere Beach as well. Using a single line of a 2 foot above the Stillwater level for freeboard won't work at Revere, because the 9 foot wave that's coming in off of Broad Sound and hammering those walls and going up and over. For example, in the Cary Circle area on the Point of Pines side, your elevations are off about 3 feet based on the flood levels that actually occurred in '78, because you have a tremendous amount of water coming over on the Point of Pines side of Cary Circle. And the water depths there were about 3 or 4 feet higher than what you're using. So that information is available. So you really have to tie in beyond Cary Circle, even for 2020 storm, 1%. So there is that information. And as far as the sand dunes go, we did a lot of physical and numerical modeling of the dunes at Point of Pines. It's by far the cheapest and most effective way to stop flooding at Point of Pines is to use the I-95 coarse embankment. And of course, you can always cover that with some of the fine green sand, stockpile it and cover it over for, you know, a white surface. But that I-95 sand was proven to be very effective against a storm far worse than anything you'd see in 2070. It's called the Standard Project Northeasters. The worst storm likely to happen would be prevented by sand dunes created by I-95 and built just slightly higher than the existing dunes that are there. So that is probably the best way of doing it. So all of these plans are described and estimated in the feasibility report that we spent a lot of work on. If you're interested in looking at it, it's on the website, the SaugasRiverFloodgate.com website. All the reports and design documents are there. So I thought I'd mention that.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Yep.
I don't see any raised hands. Just one last shout out. Final comments? No? All right, if you do have any comments, you can send them to us via email, ebaker@revere.org. And with that, I have done a round of thank yous, but I'd like to thank you all again for your time, for being with us this evening, and for being with us over the past year while we've been involved in this project. And I wish everyone to have a great evening.
Thanks, Al.
With that,
Thank you
we'll wrap
very
it up.
much, and thanks everyone for their
Thanks,
hard work
Al.
on the project.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all very much.